Hello, everybody. That's the same limp hello as last night. How many of you were here last night? You came back. That doesn't happen usually. It empties out the second day, so anyway. But yeah, it is, as I said last night, I haven't been out and about much because of COVID, so, and I miss that because I get to be in spaces with people who, as Mark was saying before, my people, right? And you don't belong to me, but it's just we're people of similar places in their journeys of faith, and that means a lot to me too, because I get that energy and it helps me a lot because I'm not always around people like that, So it's wonderful for me to just hang out with you guys for a couple days and to tell you what I'm thinking about stuff. What a gift that is. I just get to talk, and you listen, and you can't leave because it's embarrassing and all that sort of stuff. So, okay, so here, let's do this here. Some of you may remember something that was in the news back in 2013. It was a senator. His name is Rob Portman from Ohio. And he had a long track record of being very much against same-sex marriage. And some of you, if you know this story, I'm looking out here, his son came out to him. And 2 days later, he had a news release. And I have it here. I Googled it, so I'm going to read this to you. He said, this is somebody who's, has for a long time been very much against this. So he says, I have come to believe that if two people are prepared to make a lifetime commitment to love and care for each other in good times and in bad, the government shouldn't deny them the opportunity to get married. This is not how I've always felt. As a congressman and more recently as a senator, I oppose marriage for same-sex couples. Then something happened that led me to think through my position in a much deeper way. And I love that something happened, right? And isn't that the story of maybe all of us in this room? We're on a journey of faith, a spiritual journey. The word journey's become a very important word for me the last 20 years. And things happen that make us rethink things, and it's not always easy to do. In fact, I think wrestling with God is the right way to put that journey, because there's a lot of wrestling going on. Rob Portman didn't just change his view on human sexuality. He changed his view on what God was like, right? That's where this goes. It's not just an issue. He had to reconcile this very quickly with the faith that he has. And he changed, and he wrestled with God, and I think we all do. Something came up last night, and I thought I'd share a little bit about my own journey on a particular issue that has to do with hell, right? And for how many of you is that an issue, or has it been an issue in your lives, like thinking about hell and whether it's real and whether you're going there for not being sure that it exists, all that kind of stuff, right? So, and for myself, I've had something happen several times in my life that almost cornered me and forced me to wrestle with not just whether hell is real, but what kind of a God do I believe in? And the first thing for me, and again, maybe I'm hoping some of this tracks with some of you, the first is when I started thinking seriously about evolution. What does that have to do with it? Well, if there's no first person Adam who screwed up and as a result screwed all of us up and God's really mad, if you don't have that first person, the first thing that came to my mind was, what's God so mad about? And the whole fabric of, not to get into all this stuff, but the whole fabric of what Christians have called original sin, that Adam did something, and now it's sort of downloaded through procreation, literally, to everybody, and you're sort of born with not just a propensity to sin, but you're also born with Adam's guilt. And the only way to get that guilt out of your system is to confess something about the Christian faith and your faith in Jesus, and then God's going to be okay with you. But if there's no Adam, all bets are off, folks. And so that was the first thing. The second thing was, my experience in graduate school. And, I had come from a fairly conservative background, although I was never very good at it, right? I was always a little bit of a troublemaker, just on the edges. That's how I live. That's how I roll, But I was there, and you absorb a lot, right? You absorb a lot in those contexts, and good people, but still you absorb things. And then going to graduate school and doing a PhD in Hebrew Bible, as they call it, and having classmates from literally all over the world who had no idea what I believed, and we didn't really talk about it, but they would not have understood the lingo. They wouldn't have understood anything of what I said. And the thing is that they were really wonderful people, right? They weren't the bad guys, the enemies that I had always been taught they would be. Okay, you have a good time in graduate school, but don't get too close to the people. Don't learn anything. Just keep your distance and get out of there as safely as you possibly can. But you study with them, you study for exams and all that kind of stuff. You get to know them, and they're really wonderful people. They babysit your kids, you have lunch with them, and they're a lot less neurotic than a lot of Christians I know too. And so you think to yourself, what does God think of them, right? I mean, do I get a get out of hell free card because of where I was born and the influences I had, as a white male living in the suburbs in the Northeast? Had I been raised in Israel or in Europe or Africa, where would I be? How much of this is dependent on where we live? And is God really going to hold people accountable for the fact that they're born someplace else? Had I been born there, I would have been like them. And I would have thought that I was right about that, right? So it just made me think, I love these people, and we got along great, and we were friends. And if I have compassion and love for them, what kind of love and compassion does God have for them? So I had to rethink a lot about what does God think of these people? And my teachers were, three of my most important, influential teachers were Jewish. And, they were great people and, weird, like normal people and nerds, and all that kind of stuff. But, they were raised in a certain context that I wasn't raised in. And I learned more about the Bible from them than I had ever learned from anybody else. So where do they go when they die? I had to face that question. Another one, all these little things that happened to me, another thing was having kids. Nothing changes your theology quickly than kids. And I mean when they're older, But, my three children, I can't say children. Help me with the language here, folks. I have an adult son and two adult daughters. What's the collective way to refer to them that doesn't make them feel like they're 5-year-olds? Like, my kids, my children, I can't say that. If I had just sons, I could say my sons or my daughters, but I got a mixture. So it's just, anyway, my adult offspring. Let's just do that, okay? One is a very committed Christian who would fit here in this congregation, and she has one like that at home. The other two, the eldest and the youngest, are in a different place entirely, and they have, by the time they were 14, they thoroughly deconstructed evangelicalism. It makes no sense, and God went along with that, right? So, but I'm not just saying that because they're my kids. I actually don't understand how they could have turned out so good, quite frankly, with me as their dad. But they have a lot of integrity. They're genuinely kind people. They're not against anyone. They don't argue. They'll talk about anything. They're not defensive. They're not bitter. They're not belligerent. And I think to myself, they are where they are because of their influences. And they are exhibiting a tremendous amount of honesty and integrity. And I think to myself, does the creator of the universe honor that? And I said to myself, well, I do. Why wouldn't God? Does God value more our being honest and saying, I'm really struggling, or this doesn't make sense to me? Or does God want us to play church? So that made me think about that again. And then, one last thing, I've had many moments like this thinking about afterlife and hell and what happens to people like myself, right? And it's not because I'm 60. This is not, actually, it probably is. But anyway, so, and years ago, this was a big moment for me, and it went by very quickly. It took seconds, but it takes a couple minutes to talk about. I was in a taxi in San Francisco, and it was midday, and I was going to be dropped off at a church where I was speaking, sort of like this. And on the way, it was a lot of stop-and-go traffic, and I just saw people, just swarms of people on the streets of San Francisco, just one block after another. It was lunchtime. They were probably coming out to have lunch. The corporate offices were emptying, and just people. And I began thinking, just a thought popped into my head. I wonder how many of these people agree with me theologically. And my quick conclusion was not too darn many. So what does God think of them, right? And, my default mode, which I never liked, but it still seeps in, doesn't it? My default mode was there are basically two types of people. People like me and everybody else. People believe sort of like me or close to me, and then the rest of the world. And I looked at them and I said, what right do I have to look on these people like that? And I'm where I am because of my influences. And they are where they are because of their influences. There are people who hate God and frankly have very good reasons for that because of the experiences that they've had, right? So it's, am I on the right side of the ledger, again, because of my influences and because of my life? And what does God think of these people? And it really hit me that moment, and again, it's hard to recreate an existential crisis, but I was sitting there thinking, I may just be really, really wrong about God. Mind you, as I'm going to a church to talk about God for a week and they get paid for it. So, I hope the check clears after this is over. So, but it's just these things, I didn't ask for any of that, right? It just happened. Something happened repeatedly that made me just sort of stop and think about, what do I really believe about God? And then allowing that to change, which is to say, to honor the experiences that I've had, not to close them off. How many of you have been told, not in this church, I know, but elsewhere, don't trust your experiences, they're bad? A lot of you, right? Yeah. I just want to say, we are our experiences. Even the most theologically rigid people in the world who tell you not to trust your experiences, their theology is a subjective experience of reality. You can't escape that, right? So our experiences do something for us. They push us to rethink what God is like because we never quite have a handle on God. And that process of rethinking, I think, is a process of wrestling with God, with wrestling with faith. And it's very normal. There's one story in the Bible. I just want to mention one story because I think it's so good and so helpful. It's in the book of Genesis, right? And some of you know Jacob and Esau, fraternal twins. One of many dysfunctional families in the Bible, by the way, right? Jacob, these are the sons of Isaac, and Isaac is the son of Abraham, right? So Jacob pretty much swindles his brother out of his birthright because Esau is really hungry, and he says to Jacob, make me lunch and I'll give you my birthright, which is just what family dynamic therapist would have a field day with whatever's going on there, right? So, the bottom line, Jacob, he winds up living in Haran, which is way north, for about 20 years, and marries Leah when he really wanted to marry Rachel. And then he also has Bilhah and Zilpah as concubines, which is a nice way of saying baby factory. But anyway, so there they are, and after 20 years about being up there, he comes down back home, and he says, I'm going to have to face Esau sooner or later. And he's very much in a panic. And so what happens, he sends his family on ahead. He stays, and what happens, a very famous scene of the book of Genesis, a man appears and he starts wrestling with him. And you're not really sure who this is at first, but by the time the story's ended, it's pretty clear he's wrestling with God. And so they're wrestling like all night, and Jacob won't let go because he wants something from this divine being. And finally, the contest gets so crazy, let's just say God takes him and touches him on the hip and makes him limp because, the struggle's going on and God's had enough. But Jacob still won't let go because he wants a blessing. And the blessing from God is basically this. Okay, you want a blessing? Here it is. You shall no longer be called Jacob. You're going to get a name change, but you should be called Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans. So his name, Jacob, is changed to Israel, which of course is where the nation of Israel and all that stuff comes from. Israel, why? Because you have striven with God. The Hebrew word Israel, it means striving with God. That's what it means. Isra means sort of striving, and El means God. That's what the word means. So you have, the situation where God visits Jacob, and, the next minute they're sort of rolling around on the ground giving each other headlocks. And God started it. And baked into their name, Israel, is this divinely initiated wrestling match. That's a blessing. And I never really saw that way until fairly recently. Wrestling is baked into Israel's existence, and we see it all over the place. We see Israel wrestling with God in the Psalms, right? They're called lament psalms, like, oh God, where are you? Why are you not showing up again? You said this, but you're doing something else, wrestling with God. You see it baked into books like, we talked last night about the book of Job is an example of wrestling with God, the book of Ecclesiastes and various prophets. There's a lot of wrestling with God going on. Jesus is wrestling with God in the garden and on the cross. A lot of reasons to wrestle with God. And the thing about wrestling is this. I think when you wrestle, you change. And you're never really the same again. I think Rob Portman, I don't think can go back to an earlier time with his son and how his views have changed. I can't make believe that the last, 20, 25, 30 years where I've been thinking about what God is like vis-a-vis hell, I can't go back to a time before those experiences. They change you. Wrestling changes you. We can never go back to before that time when something happened. And the something that happens sometimes is big and catastrophic. Sometimes it's you just living and breathing and minding your own business and stuff happens, right? I'm in a taxi in San Francisco, happy, minding my own business, got the whole thing figured out pretty much. I'm a little humble, but I'm basically right? 10 minutes later, it's like, I don't know what to say right now, because the whole thing just turned upside down. And the absurdity of my own picture of God in my mind was exposed to me. And here's the thing, and especially for those of you who are maybe struggling in what's often called deconstruction, or, like me, fairly conservative backgrounds, and then seeing that's just not working for you. The thing is that those moments when we start saying that's not working, that's not the devil speaking. That may be God speaking. Because it's always about not keeping ourselves in the same way to think about God for all time. Right? If God is infinite, I mean, really, do the math, right? I mean, will our views never change? You know, one of my favorite professors, John Levinson, a Jewish professor, he talked in class about how, people, he knows people who are medical doctors, PhDs, and this and that and the other thing, and they're brilliant people, but in terms of their understanding of Judaism, they're still 7-year-olds. Because they've never been taught and encouraged to think, like, as you grow older, your views will change about God. Because God's not behind us, God's always out ahead of us. And I know that was my experience growing up too. And unintentionally, good people, but you're sort of stuck. So these moments, these experiences we have that make us say, uh-oh, those are actually, I think, God moments for us. We're being invited, sometimes kicking and screaming, but we're still being invited to say maybe the God that we have in our heads is too small. So here's what wrestling does. It opens our minds and apparently shuts off our mics too. This is God saying, this is my experience, God saying, you're done now. Stop talking. I'm shutting you off. I am actually done. So just give me 2 seconds here. Wrestling opens our minds and our hearts to a God who is beyond where we are. Wrestling with God is first, it is inevitable because we're people. We're human beings. We change. God stays the same. Yeah, but the God who stays the same is so far out there, we're trying to catch up. So it's inevitable. It's also a necessary part of growth, right? Growth means not staying the same. How many of you believe in God exactly the same way today as you did, say, 10 years ago? Maybe some, and that's, I'm not judging you, but I know in my case, it's like changing quite a bit. And it's just because, I'm living and breathing, and it's necessary because without that, we don't grow. God is always going to be in our image instead of us being in God's image. And it's also ongoing. It doesn't just happen once, right? I think the older we get, the more we mature, the more our understanding of God will expand and get gentler with other people. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think living that way in the wrestling, living that way it can be very hard. And, I'm not going to lie to you. But all I can say is that for me, and I think for many of you too that I've spoken with, it's also made a great impact on our lives in really every aspect of our lives, how we treat others, how we think about God. I can tell you one thing, I'm more relaxed today about my theology than I was 25 years ago, because I don't know what I'm talking about. And I know God is out there, and I'm convinced that God is love, and He's with us. And we get to try to explore and understand that if we're open to the wrestling. Thank you.